So thank you so much, everyone, for logging in today. And this is our first Zoom class at the co-op here. So hopefully everything will go all right and smoothly, but please be patient with us if something doesn't go quite as planned. So just a couple of housekeeping things about this class. As you have probably gathered already, it is a lecture demo style class. So we are going to have your microphones muted and your screens turned off. If you have any questions, you can definitely type them into the chat, and I'm going to be taking breaks throughout the lecture to answer any questions that you might have. Okay, so if you have any suggestions for us on how we can improve, aside from the obvious less choppiness, then definitely let us know, and we will hopefully improve as these classes go on. This is just the first of several scheduled classes, so that would be great. So to introduce myself, I'm Kip Hopkins. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the marketing manager at the Blue Hill Co-op. I'm also a blogger and a enthusiast of Japan and anything to do with Japanese culture. I've been studying Japanese culture ever since I was a little kid, and I've been particularly studying Japanese cooking for the last decade. I have been blogging about it for the last 5 years. And a couple summers ago, I taught some local classes, so I do have a little experience in teaching cooking classes, but not in a virtual format, so bear with me. In 2017, I was invited to study, I was invited to Japan by a Japanese television program, and we filmed an episode of Who Wants to Come to Japan, which is a show where they take Japan enthusiasts from around the world who have never been to Japan before, and they bring them there to teach them about their particular interest. So I went and shot an episode where I learned how to make kamaboko, which is a type of Japanese fish cake. Learned how to make it from some experts in Japan, which was definitely a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I was there for 11 days. I spent some time in Tokyo, and I traveled to Goto, which is an island or several islands off the coast of Kyushu. And I went to Sendai, which is in Miyagi Prefecture, over close to Fukushima. So that is a little information about me. Just a warning, I am an enthusiast, not an expert. So I want you to bear that in mind as I'm talking about a culture that is not my own, this is all information that I have gleaned over years of doing my own personal research. So bear that in mind. I am also not a nutritionist, so I would like everybody to know that as I talk about some of the health aspects of Japanese cuisine. I'm not an expert, and I'm certainly not qualified to give medical or nutritional advice. So definitely do your own research and consult with professionals if need be. So that's just a little warning. So about my blog, it's Washoku Day, or washokuday.com. And it's a blog that I started as a way to share my interest with the world. I love to learn, and I love to share what I've learned. So that is why I started this blog. I tend to write about my experience with Japanese cooking rather than sharing recipes, because I didn't grow up with Japanese cooking being the main thing in our household, so I don't have any family recipes to share or anything like that. So I tend to use other people's recipes and write about the experience of cooking them with some tips for people who might be interested in the same sort of thing. But recently I have started sharing some of my own recipes because I've been cooking a lot of keto-style Japanese meals that I have altered to make keto friendly, because I live with several people who eat pretty close to keto. So that's been something that's been happening recently. If you're interested, certainly check out the blog. Other posts that I do are cultural explorations of Japan and Japanese history. So I have a lot of interests, so I cover a wide range of things from Japanese pop culture to Japanese history, traditional Japanese music, all kinds of things. So pretty much if it interests me and I've done a lot of research on it, I will probably end up writing a blog post about it at some time. So that's the blog. So you may be wondering why you should get into trying out Japanese cooking. It's kind of intimidating for some people. A lot of people assume that it's difficult to cook in a Japanese style, but it's actually very easy. You can pretty much do it with the kitchen equipment that you have right now. Japanese kitchens actually tend to be very small and they don't usually have ovens. And so if you have a kitchen and a stove or a stove top, you can probably cook Japanese cooking pretty easily. There are of course some exceptions, but Japanese home cooking, sure, you can definitely do it. It's healthy, usually. Again, there are some exceptions, but Japanese cooking really focuses on really high quality ingredients, simple preparation. It doesn't involve a lot of oil or frying. So as long as you stick to the healthier cooking, it's usually a pretty easy thing to do. And I may be biased, but I happen to think that it is pretty much always delicious. And so why not, in other words? So a little background information. Washoku is a term for traditional Japanese cuisine and food culture. And it includes aspects like ingredients, preparation, presentation, table settings, and etiquette. It's actually been declared an intangible cultural heritage of humanity by UNESCO, and it's along with the Mediterranean diet and traditional Mexican cooking and a couple of others, so it's in good company. And it's actually a pretty recent term. It was invented in the Meiji period, which was 1868 to 1912. So a little background information. Since about the 1600s, Japan was closed until the Meiji Restoration in 1868. So closed is kind of a debatable term, but for the simplicity's sake, we'll say it was closed, which meant that there wasn't any foreigners coming into the country and citizens were not allowed to leave. So there was a long period of time where there wasn't a lot of influence coming in from outside of Japan. Then during the Meiji period, the country reopened and there was a big influx of new styles of cooking and new cultures from all over the world coming into Japan. And that style and influence of food, it was called Yoshoku, which pretty much means Western food. And so in order to distinguish between Yoshoku and the traditional food of Japan, they invented the term Washoku. So that is where that term comes from. But there is a lot of flexibility in the term, and it certainly is evolving as time goes on. Some Yoshoku is in a way considered Washoku, and it certainly isn't a there is no hard and fast rule. They certainly encourage creativity with preparation, so it's not like it's a growing concept, I guess we can say. But some prime examples of some Washoku dining would be Shojin Ryori, which is the monk diet that is traditionally vegan and vegetarian. There's Kaseki Ryori, which is a formal ceremonial style of dining. And there's wagashi, which are traditional Japanese confections. But there's also lots of dishes like miso soup and other things like that that are traditional washoku. I named my blog Washoku Day, but I do a lot of yoshoku as well. So that's just a little bit of information on that. Obviously, as with any culture, the geography has really influenced the way that food culture has developed in Japan. As you probably know, Japan is an archipelago. It's actually made up of over 3,500 islands, which is significant. There is 18,000 miles of coastline. So as you can imagine, that has made the fishing industry quite important to the development of Japanese culture. And 70% of the land is actually mountainous and rather difficult to cultivate. So that has played a big role in the development of food as well. It stretches from snowy Hokkaido all the way to subtropical Okinawa. In fact, if you were to pick up Japan and move it to the western coast of North America, which I wouldn't recommend, but if you did that, it would stretch roughly from Portland, Oregon to below Tijuana. So that's a lot of space to cover. And it's really made for a lot of regional variations in cooking. So for example, Hokkaido would be the northernmost island, and the food there tends to be pretty hearty. And also there's a lot of difference in, as a area, they actually raise a lot of beef there, and they have a lot of dairy products. They grow a lot of corn and cabbage, so that really changes the kind of style of cooking that you get in Hokkaido. They tend to have heartier, warmer, a little bit spicier foods. So if you were in Hokkaido and you got a bowl of ramen, it might be a miso-based broth, and it might have some stir-fried cabbage and corn on top, and it might have a pat of butter, like mutton. Barbecue is really popular in Hokkaido, which is very different from Okinawa, where it's mostly fish and vegetables. So there is a lot of variation regionally, as one could expect from such a large country. Seasonality is also a big influencer in Washoku. The fish, vegetables, rice, and fruits all have their peak harvest time. I took a lecture course once where the professor was talking about how when he eats at Japanese restaurants outside of Japan, he always orders something that's out of season for the time and sees if they say that it's no problem. And then if that happens, then he knows that it's not a great quality restaurant. And if they say it's out of season, then he knows that this is legit. But a lot of attention is paid to the freshness and quality of ingredients. Does anyone have any questions at this point? I think I saw there was one in chat. Let me look here. Oh, so someone asked if Japan has their own kind of beef, or is it something we would be familiar with here? So they have both. I would say that a lot of the difference in the way that meat is presented in Japan, as far as I can tell, is that they really cut their beef differently. There's a lot of like thin cut beef, which is actually pretty difficult to find here. I'm always coming up against this problem. If I'm cooking beef things, I end up buying a lot of larger pieces of meat and then freezing it partially to slice it thinner. But there are some different kinds of beef that's more with how the cattle is raised. So like you probably have heard of Kobe beef, which comes from the Kobe region, I believe. I'm certainly not an expert, but there are some different kinds of beef, but you can use regular beef as well. Hope that answers the question. So we are going to move on now to the 7 pillars of Japanese cooking. This is a concept that I certainly did not come up with, but I read about it in a book and I really liked it. I thought it was a great way to describe Japanese cooking. So, so I stole it, or borrowed it. So the first pillar of Japanese cooking is fish and seafood. So as discussed earlier, with it being an archipelago, the fishing industry has certainly been very important throughout the history of Japan. In early Japan, they ate fish and different kinds of seafood, as well as deer and boar and fowl. But back in the Kofun period, which was 250 to 538 CE, Buddhism was imported to Japan from China, and it became very widespread. And so there was actually a taboo against eating meat for about 1,200 years. it was a taboo, but it was also more or less illegal to eat red meat and pork. So fish was the pretty standard choice for that. After the Meiji Restoration, meat became more popular, and it's been rising in popularity ever since. I think that pork is the most popular meat in Japan right now, besides fish. I feel like I read that somewhere. But fish is still very important in Japan. In fact, the average Japanese person eats about 1.5 times their body weight in fish every year, which is a lot. So some of the health benefits of fish, probably don't need to tell you that fish is pretty healthy. It's low in fat and high in protein. It has a lot of vitamins and minerals. Fatty fish like salmon and eel are high in omega-3 fatty acids, which have been shown to be good for cardiovascular health, post and prenatal neurodevelopment, and they can help with age-related brain deterioration. So definitely, if you're interested in the health benefits of fish, you should look into that. Some of you may be slightly concerned about the sustainability of fishing, because there's certainly been a lot of overfishing in the world. It's definitely something to be concerned about. But there are some lists that you can look up from, like the Arizona State University has one, and some different organizations where they actually categorize fish by the sustainability of the fishing practices and by the amount of mercury that's in the said fish. So that's a great way to keep that in mind when you're shopping for fish, to make sure that you're being responsible. But there are 3 different kinds of fish that I wanted to talk about specifically. One is Alaskan wild-caught salmon, which is sustainable and low in mercury. I'm biased because I'm from Alaska, but I definitely think that it's one of the tastiest fish around. And we have smoked salmon, canned salmon, and salmon fillets at the co-op if you're looking for some. And you can certainly find recipes for all 3 types of salmon that I just mentioned from Japan. Another one is skipjack tuna, which is used to make bonito flakes. And unlike other kinds of tuna, it is actually sustainably fished, and it is low in mercury, which is pretty surprising. Oh, I see somebody just shared a link. Thank you for sustainability for fisheries. But yes, skipjack tuna is used to make bonito, which is an ingredient that's very important to Japanese cooking. So we will talk about that later. But one more I wanted to mention was eel, which is delicious. It's like my favorite kind of fish. And we just started carrying it at the co-op from American Unagi, which is a local company that sustainably raises the eel right in our area here. And eel is also high in omega-3 fatty acids, and it's quite delicious. Moving on, the second pillar of Japanese cuisine is vegetables. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time telling you how healthy vegetables are, because you ought to already know that. But I will talk some about how important vegetables are. So when I say Japanese vegetables, I'm actually talking about vegetables, mushrooms, and seaweed, which obviously only one of those is actually vegetables, but I'm jamming them all together in one category. The great thing about Japanese cooking, though, is that it doesn't really require specialty vegetables so much. There are certainly some vegetables that are harder to come by outside of Japan, but you can cook Japanese food with regular everyday vegetables that you can find anywhere, and certainly can find at the co-op. Some common familiar vegetables you would be using would be things like cabbage, spinach, potato, carrots, onions, ginger, cucumber, peppers, eggplants, and corn. Corn if you're cooking with Hokkaido recipes. But some specialty vegetables that you might not have tried, but that you can certainly still find pretty easily. And all of these we've had at the co-op either frequently or we've had them before. One is Napa cabbage, Mizuna, which is Japanese mustard, shiso, which is a member of the mint family, daikon radish, one of my favorites. You can see it in both these pictures here. And turnips, we have some Japanese variety turnips that they grow at 4 Seasons, which are quite delicious. Japanese yam or Japanese sweet potato, one of my favorites. Burdock root, which is very healthy. It's kind of an acquired taste, but it is quite healthy for you. Green onions and leeks I use to replace neki, which you can see next to the daikon radish in the picture there with the packaged vegetables. It's a type of onion. It's kind of hard to find outside of Japan, so you can use green onions and leeks instead. Shishito peppers, which are small, green, slightly spicy peppers that we have had at, in the produce department quite frequently. And then kabocha squash, which is one of my very favorite squashes. And it's just coming into season now. And there will be a recipe later to use kabocha squash. So some different ways of cooking vegetables in Japan, which are quite healthy, and the most common ways you'll come across of cooking them, which is simmered, boiled, grilled, and blanched. And some common styles of meals would be sunamono, which is thinly sliced with a vinegar or citrus dressing. Horenso no gomae, which is blanched spinach with sesame. Otitashi, which is a spinach and other spring vegetables soaked in a dashi-based sauce. We'll talk about dashi later. Nimono, which is simmered vegetables, and chikuzenni, which is mixed vegetables boiled in a strong broth. So those are some of the different types of vegetables you might come across in Japanese cooking. And again, if you're vegan or vegetarian, you should definitely check out Shojin Ryori, which is the Japanese monk diet that is very much based in vegetables. The third pillar of Japanese cuisine is rice. I totally forgot to update my slide here, so please forgive me. It is high in, oh, I forgot. Go back. Okay, sorry. I forgot to talk about seaweed. Okay, so seaweed is definitely very important to Japanese cooking. And there are several different kinds of Japanese seaweed, which coincidentally are all things that you can get right here on the coast of Maine from local companies. I like to use Atlantic Holdfast, which we carry at the co-op. So there's kombu seaweed, wakame, and nori, which we'll talk about later in more detail, but there's also hijiki, which is quite good as well. And this one's actually not a local one, but there's kanten, which is also known as agar-agar, which is actually something that comes from seaweed. It's not actually the seaweed, and it's used to make jellies and gelatinous things, and it's vegan. And it's used for a lot of wagashi, which is Japanese confections. Seaweed is high in fiber and minerals and vitamins, and it's low in calories, and it contains a complete protein. So it's certainly nice and healthy. Mushrooms, which are actually a fungi, are packed with umami, which is kind of an important aspect of Japanese cooking for sure. And let's see, mushrooms are high in vitamin D, and they're high in antioxidants, and they're high in vitamin B. Some people don't like them because of the texture, but if you like mushrooms, then there's a whole world of mushrooms to explore out there. We actually carry a lot of local mushrooms at the co-op, and so you can actually find a lot of different kinds like enoki. I can never pronounce this one, but it's called the trumpet or king oyster here. Maitake, which is also known as hen of the woods, also my favorite mushroom. Matutake and nemeko, and then shiitake mushrooms, which we certainly, you should know those as a pretty common mushroom. And shimeji, which are also known as beach mushrooms, and they are also my second favorite kind of mushroom. And finally, I just wanted to mention tsukemono, which are Japanese pickles. They're definitely different from Western pickles. They are fresh and crisp and mild, and they're very popular in Japan. Most meals have a side of pickles that come along with it. And there are shops that literally sell thousands of different varieties of pickles, but they're really easy to make at home, so most people just make them at home. You can make them with vinegar, salt, rice bran, soy sauce, koji, which is malted rice, miso, hot mustard, sugar, and sake leaves. And they're so different from Western style pickles that when they are imported to America, they actually are not categorized as pickles, but as preserved food, which is the same category that like dried fish is in. So there's definitely a whole world to explore within that. If you're interested in tsukemono, I really recommend the cookbook Preserving the Japanese Way by Nancy Singleton Hachisu. We'll talk about one of her other books a little later, but that is a really interesting book if you're interested in that. Oh, somebody asked pickled what? So all different kinds of vegetables, fruits, vegetables. You might be familiar with pickled ginger or umeboshi plums are two that are easy to find in America, but you can pickle daikon radishes, cucumbers, carrots, pretty much if you can eat it, you can pickle it. All right, now we're gonna move on to rice. Okay, and again, I did forget to update this slide, so forgive me. Rice has been cultivated in Japan since the 3rd century BCE. It's grown in swampy regions and in mountains, so it was ideal for Japan with all of its rough terrain. So it definitely took off in that way. And it's still really important to Japanese cuisine. Most meals have rice as part of them, which is why the word gohan, which means rice, is also pretty much synonymous with meal. Breakfast is asagohan, lunch is hirugohan, dinner is bangohan. In the olden days, rice was a valuable resource. It was hoarded by the wealthy, and it was used to pay taxes, and samurai worked for rice, and it was really integral. But today it is still very important to Japanese culture. Japan is the 9th biggest rice producer in the world, which is pretty impressive for a smaller country. But you can have plain rice, you can have onigiri, which are rice balls, which we'll talk about later. There's sushi rice, which is flavored with rice, vinegar, and sugar. Kakikomi, which is where you cook rice with vegetables and meat in it. Chihan, which is fried rice. Okayu, which is porridge. And then there's also mochigome, which is a type of sticky rice or gelatinous rice. Gelatinous rice, I don't think I said that right. I'm not sure what I meant. Mochiko, which is a type of glutinous, that's what I meant. Mochiko, which is a type of flour made from mochigome, and those are both used to make mochi, which is a type of rice cake, sekihan, which is red beans and rice, used for celebrations, rice crackers, dango, which is rice dumplings, sort of, and lots of other kinds of wagashi, which is the Japanese confections. You might have heard of the Asian paradox, which is a question that scientists have been pondering for a while of how Asia can have such low obesity rates while also having the most rice consumption. And pretty much what they've come up with more or less is that they eat rice and not other kinds of grains like wheat. And so if you're gonna eat grains, rice is kind of a neutral grain, so to speak. It's naturally gluten-free, and brown rice has a lot of nutrients. Personally, I like to cook with a combination of white and brown rice, you know, mixed together, because I feel you get the best of both worlds that way. But if you are not a person who eats grains, you can replace rice in a couple of different ways, which I'll talk about later. But if you are going to eat grains, rice is pretty much the safest one you can go with. Also worth mentioning is that rice also makes sake and mirin, which are two very important ingredients that we will talk about later. Soy is very soy is very important to Japanese cooking as well. Soybeans have been grown in Japan since 3000 BCE, which is quite a long time. Soy is used to make tofu, soy sauce, miso, soy milk, kinako, which is soy flour used in wagashi, natto, which is a fermented food, definitely an acquired taste. Edamame beans are obviously soybeans, so you can also just eat those by themselves. And there is some debate as to the health aspects of soy. Some people say it's healthy, some people say it's not. I don't really want to get into an argument about that, but kind of where I've landed is that you should eat unfermented soy in moderation, and fermented soy is okay, because soy contains a lot of phytoestrogen. So if you're a woman especially, you already have plenty of estrogen, so adding phytoestrogen to your in large quantities to your diet can be possibly detrimental. But during the fermentation process, it actually breaks down phytoestrogen in some cases as much as 300%. So for me personally, I eat things like tofu in moderation, but I don't really worry about eating the fermented stuff like soy sauce, miso, and I guess natto if I decided to ever eat it, but probably never will because it looks really gross. Anyway, also the fermented soy is quite good for your gut, so that's also a benefit. Wait, I went backwards. The fifth pillar of Japanese cooking is noodles. Noodles really gained popularity in Japan during the Edo period, which is the period that preceded the Meiji Restoration. And that was when restaurants became really popular in Edo, which is present-day Tokyo. But things like soba noodles, which are made with buckwheat, udon, which is a thick wheat noodle, somen, which is a thin wheat noodle, hiyamugi, which is a slightly thicker thin wheat noodle, and ramen noodles, which are an alkaline wheat noodle, and they're actually a Chinese noodle, and shirataki, which is my secret weapon. I use it in a lot of keto cooking because it is naturally keto, and it's made from the konjac yam. Noodles, obviously not the healthiest thing out there in the world, but buckwheat is highly nutritious as far as soba goes, and udon is really digestible, so it's used a lot in Japan for when you have the flu. It's definitely recommended for that. So there's some noodle know-how. Japanese cuisine pillar 6 is tea. I don't want to get too much into tea because actually the next class that we're doing is all about tea, from brewing to cooking with it. If you're interested in that, we will get into it at a later time. But tea is very healthy. It's also very common in Japan. It was brought to Japan in the 9th century. It's still mostly green tea that they grow and drink in Japan. The Japanese tea ceremony is obviously a thing that is certainly quite interesting. In Japan, tea is pretty much drunk continuously throughout the day, but it's also drunk right after dinner a lot of the time as like a replacement for dessert. I love how available tea is in Japan. When I was traveling there, you could get it at any convenience store, you could get it in vending machines pretty much every block, and it's all unsweetened because they don't really sweeten their tea in Japan. So it was wonderful for me because I don't eat sugar. But tea has lots of antioxidants. It has all kinds of wonderful health benefits. So pretty much tea is the best. And the final pillar of Japanese cooking is fruit. Although not really cooking because they don't really cook with fruit in Japan, but of Japanese cuisine. Fruit in Japan, there's a lot of indigenous fruit in Japan, but a lot of the fruit there was brought over pretty much through China or through the West. And they have really perfected the art of growing fruit. They take more care there growing fruit probably than anywhere else. Farmers will do things like this dude here who's hanging the melons so that they are perfectly spherical and do not have any blemishes from where they touched the ground. They will give them little hats so they don't get sunburned. And a lot of the time they will wrap things that are growing. They cull any blemished or weird looking fruits off of the vine so that all the nutrition in the plant goes directly to the fruit. As you can imagine, all of this makes fruit kind of expensive in Japan. In fact, there's some fruit that is so expensive that they actually have luxury greengrocers that specialize in fruit, where you can buy like apples that cost the equivalent of like $25 because they're like huge and super sweet and crisp and wonderful. But even in a normal grocery store, the fruit is a little bit more expensive than fruit in America, for sure. But it's also super delicious. All the fruit I ate in Japan was like the best fruit I've ever had in my life, especially the peach that I had. It was unbelievably delicious. Fruit is usually eaten just as is or sliced up, and it's often given as gifts. Some different fruit that is popular in Japan would be things like Asian pears, apples, satsumas, yuzu, it's kind of lemon, kinkan, which is kumquats, peaches, ume, which is usually translated as plum, but it's actually closer to an apricot. Strawberries, grapes, watermelons, melons in general are really popular in Japan. Kiwis and figs. Whoops. Oh, I see what happened. Okay, so question time. I'm going to see here. Do the Japanese use or eat kale? I've never specifically seen kale mentioned as a vegetable that they eat in Japan, but I see why no reason why it wouldn't be. And certainly I have used kale in Japanese cooking. Sometimes if there's like a green that I haven't been able to get my hands on, I will just replace it with kale. So certainly feel free to use kale. How do you spell that? I think that was about the tsukemono pickles, which is Tsukemono, tsukemono. And miso and soy sauce are the only types of fermented soy. And natto, which is fermented soybeans, but I think you might be kind of hard pressed to find that outside of Japan. And also if you're eating other kinds of soy, it's not Japanese, but tempeh is also a fermented soy product. Okay. So, as for ingredients, luckily, most of the ingredients, the basic ingredients that you need to cook Japanese food are easily available outside of Japan, and most of them you can get at the co-op. And a lot of them keep really well. You're buying fresh ingredients, once a week, and you're buying your staples like once a month or so, and they keep really well. But there are, oh, somebody says they sell natto at the Belfast Co-op, if anyone is curious and brave. Seriously though, if you haven't seen natto, it looks like macaroni and cheese was made with rubber cement. It's very strange looking. Not to dissuade anybody from trying it, certainly. Okay, wait a second here. So I'm gonna talk about some of these ingredients now. So rice is obviously very important. As I mentioned earlier, I like to use both white and brown rice, which I mix together when I cook it. One thing to keep track of when you are buying rice is that rice is very susceptible to arsenic in the environment that it's grown in. So rice that's grown in the southern part of the United States, because of the industries down there, is pretty high in arsenic, and a lot of companies don't actually test their rice for arsenic levels, which is rather disturbing. But luckily, rice grown in California is pretty safe. And rice grown by Lundberg Family Farms is even better because they actually test their rice all the time and make sure that it is low in arsenic. Plus, if you wash rice before you cook it, which you absolutely should do anyway, you will pretty much take care of that problem. But just bear that in mind when you're sourcing your rice. Rice, oh yes, so in America, Japanese rice, which is a short grain rice, is oftentimes marketed as sushi rice. This is a giant pet peeve of mine because sushi rice is rice that has been flavored with rice vinegar and sugar. It's how you make sushi. You can't make sushi without sushi rice. It actually is just referring to the style of rice that's in the dish. It's marketed as sushi rice, so if you're trying to find it, that's what you want to look for. But it is a short grain rice. It's also, it's slightly sticky, so it's not fluffy like basmati is. It's slightly sticky. It's got a very nice, mild, maybe nutty flavor. It's quite lovely. So the three building blocks of Japanese flavor are soy sauce, mirin, and sake. So we've already pretty much covered soy sauce, but there are lots of different varieties of soy sauce in Japan and in the world, really. And it varies the amount of soy it has in it versus the amount of wheat will change the flavor and the color of it. I pretty much exclusively use tamari personally because tamari is only made with soybeans, and a lot of people in my family are allergic to wheat, so it's just easier to just cook with tamari. It's the strongest, darkest of the soy sauces, so you might need to adjust some of the measurements if you're specifically cooking with something that's supposed to be made with a lighter soy sauce, but most Japanese dishes you can just use tamari. We also sell it in the bulk section at the co-op, so that's really nice. And there's a gluten-free version that you can get, and you can also get low sodium, which is nice. Mirin is a sweet rice wine, and this one actually, I have stopped using mirin because it has sugar in it, and I have been sugar-free for 4 years. So I actually just use sake and add a little bit of monk fruit sweetener to it to make up for the sweet aspect of mirin. Monk fruit is a natural sugar-free alternative that has no aftertaste, and I could talk all day about how much I love it, but I won't. So that's what I do, but certainly feel free to get mirin. And then there's sake, which you can buy like special cooking sake, but honestly, it's pretty cheaply made and it usually has additives in it. So the best bet is to just buy a regular drinking sake and cook with it. I like this big bottle here in this picture, but I also love to get these little jars at the co-op because after you use the sake, you then get a really beautiful little cup out of it. So, pro tip. Dashi is one of the other major flavors in Japanese cooking, and it is a broth that you make from bonito flakes and kombu seaweed. So bonito flakes are actually skipjack tuna, as mentioned earlier, and it is dried, fermented, and then shaved really thin. It's super flavorful. It is absolutely packed with umami. And it's also really nice to like season your rice with, or you can like use it on top of okonomiyakis, which are Japanese vegetable pancakes. So it's quite a versatile ingredient. I love it. Also, my cat is like obsessed with bonito flakes. I have to keep it in the refrigerator or he will break into the bags. Kombu seaweed is a type of kelp. You can get it from Atlantic Holdfast, and it's pretty mild, and it's not particularly palatable by itself, so you use it more to, you soak it to flavor the water rather than eating it. There are also different ways to make dashi, like you can use dried sardines for it and like some other things like that. You can make a vegan version where you use shiitake mushrooms. So there's some different things like that, but the most common version of dashi is made using bonito flakes and kombu. Other types of seaweed that are good is wakame, which is a little bit featherier, I guess, than kombu. It's got a pretty tender consistency and a really nice mildly salty flavor. It tastes like the ocean, pretty much, is like the best way I can describe it. Nori, you're probably familiar with, the stuff that they wrap sushi with, but you can also use it for wrapping onigiri. It's also pretty tasty just by itself. Ayanori is a type of seasoning that's just ground up nori, but that's pretty difficult to find. So I love to use the kelp granules from Maine Coast Sea Veg. They have quite a nice flavor, and so I use those for seasoning and garnishing and stuff like that. Some more essentials would be miso. We already talked about miso, but miso can be made from in white miso, or it can be made red miso. Those are both made with soy, but you can also make it out of like barley and some other things like that. So there are tons of different kinds of miso. We carry a lot of them at the co-op. This goen here is miso that's made in, I think they're in Whitefield in Maine. So definitely explore that option. I personally really like Miso Masters. They're organic and they just have this really lovely texture to them. They just blend into things perfectly. You can use miso for other things besides miso soup, by the way. You can use it for making like marinades, dressings. It's really versatile. It's quite lovely. Tofu, you can get firm or silken. Those are both really good. In Japan, they actually don't use tofu as a meat alternative. It's just an ingredient all on its own. So you can mix it with meat. You can have it without meat. It's just, it's cool like that. Rice vinegar, yeah, I actually really don't like most vinegars, but I like rice vinegar. So I use it pretty much for anything that calls for vinegar. I'll just use rice vinegar instead, but it's used for dressings or making sushi rice or things like that. I use it to make mayonnaise. Some other Japanese flavors are things like pickled ginger, which is a really nice garnish. Wasabi, which is quite spicy. Matcha tea, which is a powdered green tea, and you can use that both to drink or you can use it for some cooking things. Sesame seeds and sesame oil are great additions to any cupboard. I like to use sesame seeds to make gomashio, which is a toasted sesame and salt seasoning. So that's quite nice. Some non-essentials that you could still keep in your cupboard for later are things like soba noodles or udon noodles, shirataki noodles that I already mentioned how much I love, adzuki beans, which you can use for making red bean paste or for making sekihan, which is red beans and rice. You can also get umeboshi plums, which are kind of an acquired taste. They're very salty and kind of sour. So they're pretty intense, but they're also pretty good. Ponzu sauce, which is a kind of citrus-based sauce. Worcestershire sauce, which is not Japanese, but they use it in a lot of Japanese cooking. There's actually a Japanese version of it, but that's more difficult to find. So you can just use regular Worcestershire. And then a special shout out to gochujang, which is not Japanese, but is Korean, but they use it in Japan a lot. And it's this wonderful fermented chili paste that's a little spicy and it's got this lovely earthy flavor. We're gonna make a recipe with it later that uses it. So it's quite lovely. And then as far as special equipment for your kitchen, the great news is that you really don't need anything that's special. There are some things that might make it a little bit easier, but honestly, you can just use whatever you already have. But some things that you might want to think about getting, if you're going to make rice and you don't have a rice maker already, rice makers just make it like a million times easier to make your dinner. They make the perfect pot of rice every single time. So I definitely recommend getting a rice maker if you are going to make rice. I use a Vita clay, which has a clay pot. It makes a really nice rice. Some good knives are definitely important. I use ceramic knives, but certainly if you want to invest in some really nice Japanese knives, go for it. You can't go wrong. Cooking chopsticks are wonderful, versatile tools, but not everybody's used to using chopsticks, so a spoon will honestly work just as well. A rice washing bowl or a sieve. Honestly, if you're going to buy one thing on this, get a rice washing bowl because it makes washing rice so much more easy. But you can just use a bowl and sieve if you want to. Good pots and pans are just good to have anyway. A ginger grater, honestly, I don't even have a ginger grater, but man, I would love one. A suribachi is a type of Japanese mortar and pestle, which makes making gomashio easier, but it's certainly not essential. Sushi mat, if you're going to make sushi, or if you're going to make tamagoyaki, which is a type of rolled omelet, a sushi mat is pretty important for those things. Chopsticks for eating are great. Of course, not everybody in the West is super awesome at using chopsticks, but, and I'm certainly not going to judge you if you eat your Japanese food with a fork, but chopsticks are always fun to buy. And then you'll want like a variety of small plates and bowls because most Japanese meals are served in multiple dishes. So it's just good to have a collection of those. And then in these pictures here, I just have to point out that I included the picture that's in the corner is two skibochos, which are a very specialty tool that you absolutely do not have to buy because it's really only good for one thing, which is making kamaboko. But they were given to me by the Hamaguchi family of Hamaguchi Sui-san, who taught me how to make gotomaki. So those are two of my prized possessions that I just wanted to brag about for a minute. And I didn't pause for any questions, but did anybody have any questions about that? I don't see any questions, so I'm gonna go with no. But this is the anatomy of a Japanese meal. So most Japanese meals, unlike Western meals where we tend to, well, at least in theory, have a course, meal course style, where you have like your soup first and then you have, or your salad, and then you have your main dish, and then you have your dessert. In Japan, everything is served at once, except for dessert, which isn't really a concept of in that way. But it's all served together. The main two things are the rice and the soup. And if you go to a Japanese restaurant, they usually bring you the rice with your meal and they bring you the soup beforehand because they're just that ingrained in the Western mindset. A professor in a class that I took once compared it to, he said, it's like if you went to a French restaurant and they brought you a roll, and then after you had eaten the roll, they brought you a pat of butter. So the rice and the soup are meant to be eaten together. And then you've got the okazu, which are sides, and there's usually at least two of them. Sometimes there's like as much as, I don't know, 5. But one will be a protein and then the others will be vegetables. And then there's the hashi yazume, which means chopstick rest, which is sort of a metaphor for a palate cleanser. And that'll be a cold or a pickled vegetable, like a tsukemono. So that's generally the idea. And after this, we're going to run through some recipes for a Japanese style meal. Some other types of meals that are not done in this way would be things like bento, which is the Japanese boxed lunches that you might have seen online. There's also donburi, which is a type of dish that is served on top of rice. So it's like a rice bowl. Hot pot, which is a food that's cooked in the center of a table on like a hot plate. So while the food is cooking, people are eating directly out of the pot. It's like a family meal. It's a lot of fun. Noodles and soups are usually not served in this style. They're sort of standalone things. And then there's like, you can't see me, but I'm doing air quotes, Western style, which are for things like curry or hayashi, which is like a beef stew, which are usually served in one dish with rice. So rice will be set on one side of the plate and then the stew will be on the other, and then you sort of eat them together, which doesn't actually sound like a Western thing, but it is how they eat those types of things. I don't see any questions. I hope everybody's finding this interesting. So now we're going to move on to the recipe section. So these are videos that I did of myself cooking these things, and they're sped up, so nobody worry for my hands. I don't cook that fast. And I'm just going to talk over them and explain what's happening. All of these recipes were in that packet that I emailed everyone. And if you didn't get that packet, I did post it on the chat up towards the top, so you can get it there too. So first what's the difference between the soup on the left and the soup on the right? Let me look. Okay, the soup on the left and the soup on the right. So the soup in the photo on the left is a white miso soup. It looks like it has tofu and wakame in it. That is a soup that I had for breakfast at the Hamaguchi family in Angoto. The one on the right is a white miso with daikon radish in it and wakame seaweed. Oh, wait. Reverse the list on the right. Keto. Sorry, hang on a second. Oh, somebody doesn't see the recipe link at the top of the chat. I will post it after the class is finished. I'll post it on the link. Somebody is wondering what keto means. Keto is ketogenic. It's a style of eating that is low carb. So it's pretty much, there's more complicated aspects of it, but it's high fat, low carb dining, pretty much. So you would replace the grains in it, and they tend to eat fattier foods like nuts and seeds and meats, things like that. Okay, I think we got it. Somebody posted a link to ketogenic diet.